Welcome to Reintegrate, where we seek to reintegrate our faith with all of life. I'm Bob Robinson, and my co-host is David Lotney. As you may know, my book is titled Reintegrate Your Vocation with God's Mission. I received my doctorate in faith, vocation, and culture. Stephen Garber, who shaped that doctoral program with Donald Guthrie, wanted us to learn how the Christian faith informs vocations so that we can shape culture. After all, Steve's famous quote is this: "Vocation is integral, not incidental, to the mission of God." So here on the podcast, we often explore how you can participate in God's mission in and through your vocation. For Christians who work in engineering and developing technology, it's not always clear how their faith and work integrate. How can designing and using technology actually be a way of loving God and our neighbors? On this episode, we will interview 3 veteran engineers to understand how that particular vocation can be reintegrated with the mission of God. If you're not an engineer, this podcast is also for you, because the principles we discuss can be applied to how you can reintegrate your vocation with God's mission. Our guests have co-written a truly unique book. It's titled A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers, published by InterVarsity Press in 2022. Our guests, in the order in which you'll hear them, are Stephen VanderLeest, PhD in computer engineering from the University of Illinois. He is a software technical lead at the Boeing Company. Previously, he was a professor of engineering at Calvin University. He was also the first president of the Christian Engineering Society. Ethan Brue, PhD in mechanical engineering from Iowa State University. He is professor of engineering at Dordt University. He has worked as an engineering consultant in the energy generation sector and as a research and development engineer in the agricultural science and technology industry. And Derek Schuurman, PhD in electrical engineering from McMaster University. He is professor of computer science at Calvin University. He previously worked in industry as an engineer designing embedded systems.
Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen. I often joke with Bob about how our guests are so much smarter than we are. And here we have 3 PhDs in various aspects of engineering. So this time it's actually not a joke. But thanks for coming on and sharing your insights on the podcast. So really, I just want to start with a general question. Feel free. I mean, anyone can pick this up. But why did you guys write this book?
Yeah, I think there was a need. We each had some things to say, but I think we all 3 of us understood there was a need for the book. There are thousands and thousands of students pursuing engineering. There are millions of engineers. Many of them are Christian, and I think even as students, they are going to the field because they want to make a difference. They have certain skill sets that they want to make a difference with it, and we recognize that they were struggling with how does their faith come into play with their vocation. And they might not even use the word vocation. They're just thinking career, but it's much more than that. It can be a calling. And I think we have different perspectives on exactly how that puts together. There really are very few books written for people that are actually designing technology. You can find quite a few about Christians using technology. To me, it was to fill a really important need.
Yeah, that's really a good point, because I feel like even my generation, specifically coming out of college, entering the workforce, we have this mindset of, okay, my faith is in this box and my work is in this box. And Bob and I talk about it all the time. It's the point of this podcast. It's the point of Reintegrate, is I'm thinking of my 9 to 5 as 9 to 5. And then that goes back on the shelf. And then I, am a husband and a friend and a son, and all individually. And when Bob and I met and I started talking with him, I was challenged of how does all of this actually work together? Ethan, I wanted to specifically ask you, you wrote a chapter that is titled A Survey of Technology and the Biblical Story. So can you give us a short version of how technology relates to the biblical story?
Sure. I just want to make sure that you know that was an unfair question. A short a short response on that one.
Well, earlier we joked that we're going to be recording this for 2 hours. So there you go.
We'll go that full 2 hours. Yeah.
Okay, I got 2 hours.
Just on this question alone. Yeah.
He's a professor, so he's used to speaking for 50 minutes at a time. So be careful.
Oh, no.
All right. We'll keep it short. It is a good question. And I think that's one of the things as a teacher, you always have to remember, how can I take this complex subject and distill it down to 2 or 3 sentences at the beginning of the course? People aren't going to be with you unless you can say it in a pithy and short way to draw them in, to make them understand the big picture first, and then you can get into the details. And I think that's, in many ways, I think that's what I would say is how technology relates to Scripture as well, is like, don't start by looking for technology. Start by understanding the bigger picture. And once you understand the bigger picture, technology falls into that story. And the bigger picture is simply this, that we're humans, and that being human means making and shaping things. It means making music. It means making cities, and it means a whole bunch of other things as well. But doing technology and being human go hand in hand. And I don't think there's any reason why we need to necessarily question that. Sometimes, your students just can take that face value. Oh, I get that. Now, being human and hearing Scripture is also 2 things that go together. Scripture is meant to be a word for humanity, from God, saying, I love what I create, and I will not rest until this good creation comes back into its proper relation with me. And that I'm going to make happen. So God covenants with his people, and he draws them to himself. And that's the rest of the story, from creation to the end, as we see this beautiful picture of how God brings his creation back via humanity. And so in that sense, you might say that doesn't deal with technology a lot, but it does, because bringing back humanity means bringing back everything that humanity was supposed to do to begin with. It's a, what are we saved for question? You can talk about salvation. These are all good conversations. But ultimately, when we get done with all these really complex biblical theological questions, we ask, but what was salvation for to begin with? And it was for bringing us back to what we were supposed to do in the first place. And that was to take care of things, to cultivate, to make something of it, and to do it all God with us, that he would be present in that garden with us, and we would simply enjoy him and do things like art and technology. So that's probably a longer answer.
No, it's actually, most people they think the gospel starts at the cross. And as central as the cross is, the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, it doesn't start there. It starts with creation, right? If you don't get creation right and what God is redeeming, then you don't really understand the cross. You don't really understand that Colossians says that by the blood of Christ, all things are reconciled to him. And that's everything, right? And so, yeah, that's so key. And that's what most people don't get is creation. God created, and therefore he created us to be creators. And that's what it means to be human. That's awesome.
Derek, you wrote a couple of chapters that talk about ethics and human pride as it relates to technology. So what are the unique ethical challenges for an engineer? And kind of going alongside that, how and why do we idolize the technology, and what do we do to counteract that?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question. We have a chapter called Beyond Engineering Ethics, where we sort of look at, typical engineering ethics curriculums, which anyone who's a student in a typical engineering curriculum will encounter at some point. And a lot of these engineering ethics tend to be looking at different approaches. So deontological ethics is one approach where you actually look at rules and principles for engineering. There's another approach to ethics that sort of just looks at the ends, consequentialism it's called. And then there's sort of a virtue-based ethics, which is more becoming a certain kind of person. And in our chapter, we lean towards that sort of virtue-based ethics, because we sort of start with the premise that what we're called is to become a certain kind of person, to develop Christian character. We lean heavily actually on N.T. Wright's book, After You Believe, and he's got a wonderful example in there of Captain Sully, the miracle on the Hudson, how he landed his plane. And in a few moments after this emergency occurred, he had to take stock of the whole situation. He didn't have the luxury to thumb through manuals or pull out a calculator or anything like that. He had to just instinctively know what to do. And after tens of thousands of hours in the air, he sort of had developed those sort of instinctive abilities to know how to respond to a particular situation. And he safely landed the plane on the river. And of course, he stuck behind as well, making sure everyone was safely out of the plane. And N.T. Wright says that's the kind of character development that we need to be thinking about too, becoming the kind of people that sort of instinctively know how we ought to respond in certain situations, becoming the kinds of people who know God's will and then know how to respond to the situations that come up. A lot of engineering ethics courses will take use of case studies. And these case studies are often very remote kind of dilemmas that rarely occur in the real world. And it makes it seem like ethics is something you take off the shelf when a particularly puzzling dilemma comes along. And we're trying to kind of zoom out a little bit and say, no, ethics is something that ought to inform. We actually use the broader term norms for life and design norms, ought to inform all of life, that we live coram Deo, before the face of God, and everything that we do, as Ethan has alluded to as well, right? We do in obedience to God or in disobedience to his laws. And so we sort of try to zoom out a bit and look at ethics in a much broader scope, a much more comprehensive scope. And so, and then the chapter on sin, which you've also asked about, is also one where I think technology and the practices of working as an engineer can shape you in certain ways as well if you're not careful. And one of the pitfalls is sort of developing a trust in technology, or if you're always looking at the world through a technological lens, to develop this sort of technological worldview where you see everything as a technological problem that can be solved with a technological fix. And I think there again, it's looking to make sure that we that we don't fall into the trap of trusting technology, making it an idol, seeing it as the solution to every single problem. And we know too that our digital devices and a lot of the technologies that surround us also have certain habits and rituals associated with them that have tremendous shaping power. So one of the sub-themes in both the chapters about sin and about ethics is being shaped to be the kind of person that God would have us be, and then learning how to develop practices in our own lives too that help us to become that kind of person who knows how you ought to respond when you encounter different situations as an engineer, but also in your wider life.
Help me walk me through this a little bit, Derek, as far as maybe give me an ethical dilemma that might be in one of these case studies, and how maybe someone who's at a secular school taking an ethics class would see that, and how you would teach it based on the values-based ethics. Or how would it be different?
Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis in secular engineering education on codes of ethics. So the National Society for Professional Engineers, NSPE, has a code of ethics, and they're sort of set rules for how you approach certain things. And so if you were to encounter a situation, a lot of case studies proceed by saying, well, which ethical theory applies? Do we apply a deontological theory, or do we look at consequentialism, or is there a virtue ethic here? And I think that more broadly, what we're trying to encourage is to think about what it means to love your neighbor. How do I care for my neighbor and care for the earth and its creatures? How do we look at some of the norms that are brought up earlier in the book? These are norms that think about things like justice, things that look at social norms, that look at stewardship, that look at cultural appropriateness of our products, that look at other ethical issues, trust issues. All of these sorts of things get wrapped into that more holistic way of looking at an engineering problem. And we call these things actually the design norms. We list about 7 or 8 of them, and we encourage our readers to think about each of these different areas. And again, the point there is not to see the whole world as a technical problem to be solved, but the world creation. Going back to creation is multi-aspectual. There are these different aspects to creation that can't be all represented as data, that can't all be represented as engineering problems to be solved, but that we need to be able to attend to these different areas of creation in ways that care for them in appropriate ways. And so these norms sort of are a theme that run through the book and appear in numerous places. Steve has a chapter where he actually just completely goes over each of the norms in details with giving practical examples. And then in terms of how that sort of works out, the final chapter, chapter 10, is called Letters to a Young Engineer. And there we actually sort of have this sort of sequence of letters between an older engineer and a young recent graduate. And he brings up sort of practical issues that he's encountering in his job. You know, he's being asked be a little dishonest on a timesheet. He's sort of asked to work on a Sunday, you know, these sorts of things that come up. He encounters some issues in a project that he's working on. And there's this sort of sequence of letters that go back and forth between this older engineer and this younger engineer, who's sort of encouraging him to sort of develop in his Christian walk, and the implications then also for his work in engineering.
Steve, is there something in those norms that you want to highlight for us?
The list that we have is a way for engineers to think through and structure broader questions about how to make choices within the design. Engineers are taught to do calculations to minimize cost for particular design, to ensure it meets a certain set of requirements. But there's these broader questions of who are we designing the technology for? How do I put that in that broader context? So Derek mentioned one of them, justice. If you think about justice, then if you're designing, for example, an autonomous automobile, you might just narrowly thinking say, well, I'm going to minimize the cost for the buyer. But if you think a little more broadly about justice, then you're going to say, well, who else is involved? Pedestrians. How are we protecting them and ensuring they're safe if they walk in front of this vehicle that's driving itself? So that norm of justice, it's a biblical principle, says that you have to think about more than just the person paying for it. Certainly you have a responsibility to them. You're selling them a technology that you're claiming does, solves one of their problems, transportation perhaps. But thinking about these norms really derived from biblical principles like justice, you're going to think more broadly. Stewardship is another one where you're going to think about, are we using resources appropriately? What is the impact on the environment for this technology? So we hope it prompts deeper thinking, stepping back a little bit to say, not only how do I solve this problem, but is this the problem I should be solving, that I ought to be solving? We hope that this gives them some structure, however, to suggest this would be a better design if I chose this way, and here's why. And I think even for people that are not coming from a Christian background, they get the concept of justice, of fairness, right, of protecting people. And so I think it will give them language to convince, it's usually a team that's designing technology, to be persuasive within the team, to be, that light amongst that team to say there may be a better way to do this. And I don't think we'll claim it's the perfect list or the only list, but it is a way to think about how to bring Christian faith right into the design process. So it's not just how we behave with one another so that I ethically behave and tell the truth to my colleagues when I'm at work, but it actually influences how I do the work. It influences the design that comes out.
This is where engineers have to accept, you said, responsibility for their choices, right? They have to make design choices all the time, but nobody wants to accept responsibility, do they?
Those two things are connected, by the way. One of my frustrations with a lot of engineering textbooks were that the homework problems often did have one answer. There was a right answer. That almost never happens in reality. There's usually multiple possible answers, and you have to choose between them.
Right.
Or sometimes there's no answer, and you have to recognize this is not a solvable problem, right? So textbooks, I think, are often misleading for students, and it's easy to grade when there's one answer, but it's not realistic. It requires a much deeper thinking in terms of how do I make those choices, and those choices are impacted by all of those criteria, those different norms. If there were no choices, you wouldn't need the engineer. You just push the button, it calculates, here's your technology. But it's inventive, it's creative, it's making moral choices in any design.
A phrase that kind of caught my eye was design for Shalom.
That's right.
I do love that. What does it mean to design for the flourishing of the people who be?
That's right. So how are things supposed to be? And I think I can give kind of a personal example. It is not supposed to be that my eyes don't work that well. And it's not supposed to be that I'm losing my hearing. So I have a hearing aid in there that helps with hearing. This technology of eyeglasses and hearing aids is, in my mind, redeeming these flaws that have shown up as I aged. And it wasn't supposed to be that way. And so the technology is rehabilitating, is redeeming those senses that have not worked so well for me. And so designing for Shalom is how are things supposed to be?
Derek, in one of the chapters, Deuteronomy 22:8 was quoted, when you build a new house, make a parapet, which is a railing, around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. So like an engineer making a roof in biblical times has said, you got to take care of these people or else it's your fault. How should that inform an engineer in 2023?
Yeah, I think it's a way of saying, love your neighbor as you're building different products, thinking about their safety, about their well-being. And I would add all of creation. So Shalom is the flourishing of people, but it's also the flourishing of the entire creation. And so looking at sort of environmental impacts, looking at how technology sort of impacts our cityscapes and our landscapes. I think one of the norms is also an aesthetic norm. One of the norms we talk about, it's beauty. Beauty is a biblical principle as well. And so as we're thinking about technology, also looking at its form and its function so that it's not just efficient, but it's pleasing to use. Nicholas Wolterstorff has this quote where he talks about a good spade is one that's not only good for digging, but it's just pleasing to use, and so thinking about industrial design in terms of those things as well. And so it's sort of this more full-orbed way of looking at product design, and these norms, like Shalom is when all of these norms are sort of at play. Oftentimes, when you emphasize one norm over the others, you have shortcomings in certain areas that cause problems. And the notion of Shalom is to sort of be attentive to all of these things at once. One of the big temptations, and the philosopher Jacques Ellul was a big critic of this, was designing everything for absolute efficiency all the time. And that's not the kind of world we want to live in, where everything's all about just efficiency. And so thinking normatively has to do with being attentive to the wider scope of creation and helping all of it to flourish, which is sort of what we were called to do already in Genesis before the fall, is to sort of care for the earth and fill it with all of its latent potential, and to do that well.
Bob, that parapet did not prevent people from falling off. It helped them know where the edge was, but it wasn't a fence over the whole roof. And to me, that's telling. The engineer was said to do what's reasonable to protect and be hospitable to guests on the roof, but the user had responsibility as well. In that Deuteronomy passage, they once they get near that parapet, they have to realize, I have to be careful. I'm at the edge.
Yeah.
So it's a shared responsibility. Engineers have part of it, but they maybe designed that parapet, and then somebody came in to actually construct it. Well, the construction company better have used the right materials, or the parapet might not do its job. They had responsibility as well. As we think about technology, all of us have some part in how do we use it properly for Shalom? How do we use it carefully so that it doesn't injure our neighbor? It's a partnership with all of us.
tend to always talk about engineering and failures together, don't we? I always tell my students, engineers never get noticed when things work right. They always get noticed when they break down. And it's a fascinating story. I try to say, hey, are you sure you want to go into the profession? The only time you'll get noticed is when things go bad. But there's something interesting about that too. When we talk about shalom or delightful harmony, like to actually design, for instance, a heating and ventilating system that doesn't get noticed is actually the best system, right? If you're hot or if you're cold, it's a problem. But if you absolutely don't notice it, you're in here using the space, it's for a good conversation, it's for a good cup of coffee, and you never notice the temperature, that's like the perfectly beautiful design. That's shalom. So it's interesting. In some ways, I'm talking about an aesthetic thing. You're trying to actually design aesthetically so that there's this delightful harmony for the purpose of which that space is being called into being for, whether it's a coffee shop or a library. So I just always observe that. This is just a fun comment to make as students. I get so excited about engineering. I say, hey, watch out here. You do your work well, you'll never get noticed.
So at one point in the book, we talk about discerning the difference between finiteness and fallenness. So sometimes things are not the way they're supposed to be because of sin, because of our sinfulness. But also as engineers, we need to have a posture of humility. This is another virtue, another character trait, because we can't always anticipate all of the kinds of unintended consequences or some of the effects, especially of a new design. And so learning how to build in such a way that we take into account some of our finiteness as well. Sometimes things fail not because of sin necessarily, but just because we don't know how every single structure is going to operate under every single set of conditions. And so that requires sort of a sound engineering process, sound engineering judgment, good testing, and a variety of other things, but not to be so confident that we can that we know exactly how things are going to happen. And it's not just technically how they're going to perform, but socially. Every single new technology is a kind of social experiment in a way. And so having a kind of posture of humility is also a way of loving our neighbor, understanding that these technologies are have a huge sort of potential to disrupt people's lives. I was just telling my students today in one of our capstone courses, quoting Neil Postman, who said, technology is not additive, it's ecological. You can think about a drop of red dye going into a glass of water. You don't have a glass of water and a drop of red dye. You have a whole new substance. It's like unleashing a new species into eco preserve. You're basically introducing a new sort of social technological artifact into a community with what could have a lot of unexpected results. And so technology is complex because of that. So yeah, a posture of humility is really important as we rather than the Silicon Valley narrative, which is move quickly and break things, move responsibly and love your neighbor towards shalom, I think is probably a better mantra for our engineers.
If I'm designing a car engine and I'm too proud, I might say that's never going to overheat. But in humility, I add a dashboard light that tells the user the engine's overheating. It shouldn't have happened, but I've got that warning light there in humility that something might happen beyond my control. An aircraft can have no single point of failure. It shouldn't fail, but because something could happen that I didn't anticipate and people's lives depend on it, the computer flying the plane is redundant. If a bit goes wrong in one place on the plane, there's another completely redundant unit that is being compared to that to ensure that the plane continues flying safely. And sometimes it's triple redundant. It is, I view that as a form of humility, saying we can't anticipate everything, so we have to build in fail-safes and safety nets in order to protect lives.
I wanted to know everything when I started my job. I was like, well, I want to be the point two guy. I want to have the answers. I want to feel confident with what I'm doing. And then with what I learned in marketing is you don't know. And it's a lot of testing, and just like engineering, it's a lot of testing, and it's a lot of, all right, that didn't work. And I came to a point where I'm like, okay, I don't know is one of the best answers I can give, because I'm that doesn't stop me. I'm going to research and I'm going to do my part, everything I can to A/B test, what we call it, and make sure of seeing what will stick for this certain ad or something along those lines. The humility of, I may not have all the answers, but I'm willing to test it, and I'm willing to see which one is going to fail and which one's going to stick, and be happy with that. And also knowing that, I'm going to be working behind the scenes. So, that comment about engineers aren't really noticed until something goes wrong. Recently, my wife and I, we had our furnace break, and it was on the coldest day it was when, Northeast Ohio was in like the negatives. And of course, that was when we realized, we really appreciate having a furnace that works. And we didn't think about it before. And we had a guy come out, and, he was making a joke about, no one's ever really happy to see me, but, I'm here. And when he left, he was like, well, I hope I don't have to see you again. And just kind of jokingly, but it's true. So when I think about these jobs, and I think about the people behind the software, the people behind the engineering, they may not, always receive all the glory, but their job is focused on, really, if this goes right, I can take my hand off of it and let this do what it should because of the system set in place.
I work a lot with people who are running businesses or a small cog in a large machine, right? Yeah. And it's like, all I do is this little thing. And so, but that little thing is part of something grander. And you have to see yourself as part of God's hands, bringing flourishing to people who will be actually doing or using or whatever the end product that you're working on. It's hard to do, isn't it? Sometimes when it's so our work is so minutia.
But that's a manager's responsibility. If you think, for the person that is asking someone to design that little cog, to give them a vision for how it plays out more broadly.
Yes.
When I'm leading a team, I think it's so important to actually get them to be able to see the end product. Mm-hmm. And I've sometimes asked customers of my designs, I want my team to see it in use, because then they understand the importance of the part they're doing. And I've never had a customer turn me down for saying, I want the team to understand where this is going. It's good for them too, but it enables that engineer to flourish, because they see, I'm not just doing this rote work. This is how it makes a difference. So I think your point is right. Often people don't get to see how it plays out and how it makes a difference. Shouldn't we as a community try to enable work that you do understand why it makes a difference, how it plays into the bigger picture?
Yes.
I think that's our joint responsibility.
I think there's a misnomer about the engineering mindset when you say, that person has an engineering mindset. Sometimes that means they're very rational. Sometimes it means they can calculate real fast, those kind of things that typically come along. You should be an engineer sort of thing. But I think the engineering mindset is this, that they take deep joy when somebody comes up after something works and they said, wow, I didn't realize it could be this way. Like, I didn't realize my work could be this way, better, safer, fuller, more rewarding, and I think my experience from industry, I remember the technology. I remember when it popped and clicked in the right times and when all those things worked. There's joy in that as well. But I think the things that stick with me are when those people came back and said, I didn't realize we could do it this way. And I didn't realize that this would enable us to, and then fill in the blank. So it's that people, it's the community, it's seeing what that technology is enabling, I think, that I believe is the true engineering mindset, the one that keeps people engineering the most.
Yeah, there's something really satisfying about, you work on a product and you see it on the drawing board and in the manufacturing line, and then you go out in the real world and you see one in the wild and you see someone using it, and you see, hopefully it's making someone's life, opening up possibilities for their work and for their lives in ways that make things richer. And then I think there's nothing more satisfying than seeing those end effects contributing to Shalom, let's say. Yeah.
I have a number of engineers in my family. My nephew is an engineer, and he loves to do photography. He's all very much into the technology of his cameras, but it's more of, I want to get the perfect photograph. I want to be able to frame it perfectly. I want to get it when the sun is just right, setting over this mountain. And it's like, and he tells, I had this conversation with him last year, and he's like, I don't understand why that's important. My photography, because I know my engineering is important. I said, you don't see the connection. So tell me the connection between technology and creativity, like painting or music or photography or cooking. My other nephew is an engineer. He loves to cook, It's like, tell me what the connection is there.
If I was to give you a quick take on the last 20, 30 years of technology in our world, I'd say it's really strong on innovation and really short on imagination in many ways. I mean, I know that maybe be a negative way of saying it, but we're really good at making the next change, but we're not always real good at imagining a different world on the other end. We know we can make it faster. We know we can make it bigger. We know we can make it more efficient, right? But I think that's where I would tie your question about creativity in. Creativity doesn't just improve. Creativity actually says, how could it look different? How could I surprise the culture and make them think, do, or interact differently in a good way? And I think that's probably where I would say engineering's never rationally about taking it to the next level, because we don't know what the next level is if we don't have an imagination for where we're actually going. I think that's one of the things that I think our culture needs to spend more time with. We have a tendency to simply assume we know that faster is better, bigger is better, those kind of things. So it's one avenue where creativity can play a role, I guess.
I tie it to the Imago Dei, that part of humans reflecting the image of God is also having that capability of creativity. When I see, an engineer who also loves photography or cooking or music, to me, those are just different aspects of that creativity coming out. And it has that tie back to that, the Genesis chapter. The first person in the Bible that we're told is given the Spirit of God or filled with the Spirit of God is Bezalel. He's a craftsman. He's an engineer. He's given that spirit to design artistic elements of the tabernacle. And so I'd say that creativity is part of us being human. And in fact, God can give this measure of his spirit for callings like what Bezalel had.
I feel like as a creative person, there's been so many times in my life where it's like the creatives and the engineers, the creativity side of your brain, the logical side of your brain. And it's always like almost pitted against each other. And I think you guys have made so many good points of it's so beautiful when it comes together and works in harmony.
You have a sense of that when the form and the function have harmonized together.
Right.
That's the most beautiful design, is that the function is integrated so well with the aesthetic. And I think we all recognize those beautiful things. Derek mentioned the example, the spade that feels right? There's a number of technologies that I can think of that, are clunky. And I think, boy, this could be better. But there's some others that it's a pleasure to use. And I think that's our sense of we've a couple of the design norms get at that, the design norm of harmony. That's not just that it's beautiful, but that the function and the form fit together well.
Yeah. So a Christian graduates from a university and begins his or her first job in the field of engineering. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. Well, yes, I am. My son, Joel, begins his first job this month after graduating with a mechanical engineering degree at Ohio State. So my main message through the ministry Reintegrate is that we are all called to reintegrate our vocation with God's mission, that we participate in the mission of God through and in our work. So how can a certain someone who would remain nameless, except for the fact I just named him, how does he work in engineering for a huge international secular construction corporation? How does he understand that work as part of God's mission in the world?
Fear, trembling, and joy. I thought I'd add the last one. Fear and trembling are the first things that come to mind, but I worked for a very large company as well. And I'll just express the honest tension that exists as a Christian in a space like that. You do feel the pull of winds that you can't change, or that you don't have the power to change. And at the same time, you'll see these little pockets, sometimes in a conference room, sometimes on the shop floor, of just adding, but what if we did this? But why have we always done it this way? And that actually people will stop and listen. And you might not be overtly Christian in what you just said, but it's coming with putting on this narrative of what God is doing. And you walked into the situation and you blurted out that question that was really asking about caring for maybe a creature, maybe a species that we hadn't talked about. Maybe it was about how you were dealing with the waste product that you were generating, and you simply asked the question. Maybe it was a question about how this is going to impact the workers in the manufacturing facility that you were going into with this technology. It might not be what I'd say overtly Christian, but it comes from that becoming that is at the root of being Christian, becoming Christ-like, and things like that come out. So face value, I remember the days of feeling helpless in many ways. Like this direction, I'm not sure the big direction is where God really wants our culture to go. But I think I can steer this slightly in a way that may just put a small light, a small beacon of what it could be if we ask a few more questions, if we put it in a little different context. That's maybe the best I have to offer.
Yeah. Our last chapter, Letters to a Young Engineer, kind of exactly depicts that scenario. And while it's while all of the characters depicted are not real characters, alive or dead, they're actually inspired quite heavily by conversations that I've had with former students, and also my own experience being in industry for almost a decade. Oftentimes, you start at the bottom of the totem pole by necessity, and your influence and your opportunities for big change are limited. But I think we're still called to be faithful in that kind of setting. That especially as an engineer, there's lots of opportunities where you're around the table, where decisions are being made, where you can nudge things closer to Shalom. And I think it also is multi-aspectual in terms of it shows itself in how we relate to our employees, how we relate to our customers. And one of the things that this older engineer in these letters in the last chapter, the older engineer is speaking to this younger engineer, reminds him that our first and foremost vocation is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, and then everything else flows from that. And so our career as engineers is not our whole vocation either. We're also neighbors, and we're part of a church, hopefully, and we're perhaps part of a wider network or family. And so to think about ways to serve God faithfully in all these other sorts of parts of your life as well, and work being just one aspect where we're called to be faithful.
I watched my son do his work when he was at home doing internships, and I was just looking at him doing his computer-aided design, and I was just like, what are you doing? I don't understand this thing that you're doing, but he does. So
and some of our students will go on to be Daniels in Babylon, like people who will actually have tremendous influence in large corporations and will have an opportunity to make substantial change, be able to influence perhaps the direction of some of these large companies that shape so much of what we work with and how we live and communicate. But even if not, we're called to be faithful in the place that God puts us, and in all engineering roles, there are opportunities to bring Shalom nearer, I would say.
Well, that's that word of bringing Shalom. I mean, if we frame the mission of God as reinstating Shalom and reinstating universal flourishing, delightful flourishing for everyone and everything in the creation, that's what God's doing in the gospel of Jesus. an engineer or anybody in any field of work, you are not a second-class Christian because you're not a missionary in Botswana. You are a first-class Christian being used by God to bring flourishing to this world. And I just want to encourage anybody listening to the podcast to remember that and to dive into that and to own that. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, guys.